Welcome back to Newsmaker Live on DBS with me, your host, Laura Jean-Pierre. A few weeks ago, we tackled the issue of rape and it being St. Lucia's dirtiest secret. While on that show, we had quite a few calls actually, from persons giving their testimony, their stories about their own rape situations. And for that, we were quite grateful. We heard from so many people who expressed the horror that they felt when being raped, the fact that they felt ashamed that they hid it, that they didn't speak about it, they didn't even talk to their parents about it. And that touched me very much, and it was a very humbling experience. And over the past couple of weeks since we've had that show, I've been getting so many calls and messages from persons who appreciated that show. Some of them didn't have the nerve as yet to call on air to speak about their issues and their experience of rape, but they felt comfortable enough to speak one-on-one about it, and they were very grateful to hear that they were not alone, stressing on the alone part. A lot of the times, rape victims feel alone. During that segment as well, we had a couple of male callers who stressed on the fact that whenever the topic of rape comes up, it is usually spoken about in the feminine gender, meaning there has been little to no focus on male rape. And one caller even suggested that we were being hypocrites and that there are tons of men out there who have experienced rape. So I promised that the next time we did a rape show, we would do it on male rape. And I started doing some investigation immediately after the show. Unfortunately, this morning, I got a call from my guest who said that they had an emergency and would not be able to be with us today. So I said, oh my goodness, at the 11th hour, while I understood the situation, I thought to myself, we would definitely have to do a repeat of a previous broadcast, because where am I going to get a guest at this time? Anyway, I thought about it and I said, you know what? The answer will come to me on my drive to work. While driving to work this morning, I turned on to a particular radio station and lo and behold, there was the host of that show with his guest, a lawyer, who was talking about issues of rape and confidence and boys and girls and the decisions that they take. But it really struck me when they started talking about rape. And one thing that the lawyer said, which caught me unawares and caught me by surprise, was when he said that rape had a gender. And prior to the rape segment that we did a couple of weeks ago, I also was of the belief that rape had a gender, because in 2003 or thereabouts, when Mr. Vincent McDoom came out expressing his horror that the person who had perpetrated a rape on him was or had become a very prominent member of society, one of the arguments for his perpetrator was the fact that Mr. McDoom would have a tough time defending or putting up some sort of defense to prove that he had been raped, because the law at that time described rape as the forced sexual intercourse by a man against a female. And lo and behold, there was this lawyer today using that same archaic definition of rape. But in my investigations, in my research, I found out that that law had been repealed, and that with the new criminal code, that rape had become gender neutral. Gender neutral. And so what does it say about rape, the new gender neutral rape law? It says that there's a new provision which specifies that carnal knowledge could involve any gender. I'll repeat that. Carnal knowledge could involve any gender, male or female. In other words, an unlawful homosexual act can be constituted rape. The new clause defines rape as any unsolicited or unconsensual sex with any person. Any unsolicited or unconsensual sex with any other person is constituted rape. So when I heard that, right away, it was not an option to do a rebroadcast of another show. So tonight's show is going to be a little bit of a teaser, because having had to restructure this show, so much more information came on, but at the 11th hour, I couldn't get the requisite persons to come on. So we're going to have another open mic session, just sort of a teaser, speaking to issues of male rape. Now, I know that in our homophobic society, men tend not to want to talk about these experiences of theirs. As a matter of fact, one of the things that a lot of people say when you're talking about rape and whatnot is that they will tell you, okay, all these guys, who go to Bordelais, they go to jail. When they come out, they all are gay. They stay in prison for 7 years and 10 years and 20 years or whatever. When they come out, they're all gay because that's what they do. And there's a lot of rape going on in jail and all of that. Well, St. Lucia, it would interest you to know that I called up Bordelais, and according to Bordelais, according to the officials there, in the 13 years that Bordelais has been in existence, there has never been a reported case of rape. Okay? There has never been a reported case of rape at Bordelais, nor has there been any reported incidents of sodomy or buggery, as it is described in our law books up in Bordelais. So this is according to the officials at Bordelais. So those of us who seem to think that rape is rampant and homosexuality is rampant, or buggery or sodomy is rampant in Bordelais, that, according to the officials there, is not the case. Okay? But we do know that rape exists, men against men. Now, what does the face of a male rape victim look like? We say so many, we think of so many things. We think of this child who is not doing well in school, or this young man who is hooked on drugs, or this middle-aged man who has made nothing of his life and is just a wastrel. We think of so many things, none of them really positive. But let me share with you the experience of a man who has been raped. He says, in his own words, at the age of 8, a child's mind should be on school and play, on trucks and toys, and growing up to be whatever catches his or her fancy for the moment. Pre-adolescence should be years of innocence, naivety, and blissful ignorance. But when a child is thrust into adult situations that he is not mature enough to handle, that child will fall into a downward spiral of confusion that is not easily reversed. At the age of 8, he says, he was hurled into a chasm of confusion by a violation of rape. This Pandora's box was opened in his prepubescence and introduced him to adult sexualities, issues, and perversions far beyond his years, and definitely beyond his ability to escape without damage. On June 6, in 1968, a tragedy struck his family that would change their lives forever. While playing in the yard with his 6 siblings, he made a neglectful mistake. Remember, he's only 8 years old at the time, but he describes it as a neglectful mistake. Most persons would think of it as a child being a child. But this is the damage that has been done to him, that he could take on the world of responsibility on his little 8-year-old shoulders. He was supposed to be watching his 2-year-old brother, Thomas, but he left him in the ungated yard to cross the street to retrieve a ball. Unbeknownst to him at the time, Thomas was following him. That's usually the case with little siblings. The younger ones, they look up to the older ones, and whatever the older ones do, they want to do it too. So he crossed the road and this little boy followed him. Watching from the living room window, his mother screamed for him to get the baby. He turned around just in time to see his baby brother struck down by a speeding car, killed, with his mother and himself watching helplessly. His mother got to him just in time to hear his baby brother's last words. His last word was "Mommy." His family had never experienced this kind of trauma before, and his mother was devastated. After seeing that tragic event in front of their home, his mother had to get away. After a few nights at his grandmother's house, his parents sent all of the children to be cared for by their uncle, Clarence. What they had no way of knowing was that this family member was a pedophile. It is not necessary, he says, to recount the horrid details of this invasion, but that very night, he was sexually abused and raped by his uncle. And it caused great hurt and confusion in his life for many years to follow. He realizes now that this happened because the uncle himself was a broken man. He was unhealed, with no one to help him. In spite of the damage done to him in his life, he understands and forgives wholeheartedly. How many persons, having suffered this atrocity, can so willingly forgive? But a seed had been planted. A seed, he says, of homosexuality that he would struggle with for many years to come. He was not born with the sexual urges, he says. It wasn't chromosomal and had nothing to do with his DNA. These tendencies surfaced because a broken man had thrust an 8-year-old boy into this whirlwind. Thus, his first sexual relationship was with a man. Before he could ever know the purpose of pleasure of a woman, have his first date, or even his first kiss, that wound was inflicted and the seed was planted. Now, this is his description of what happened to him, and as you could tell, I guess, he was homosexual for a long time. And he goes on to say that he received Jesus a year after the rape. So at age 9, he had been baptized again. But his struggle, he says, was just starting. He had feelings and thoughts that he knew weren't right, and compelling desires that made it difficult to interact with male figures. He says that his only relief was to this turmoil was the church and music. He escaped in music. And then he talks a little bit more about how he coped through his music. But then he goes on to say that at age 13, St. Lucia, he was sexually molested again. This time by Uncle Clarence's son. Makes you wonder, huh? If the seed of homosexual lust and desire was planted by his uncle, he says, it was surely fertilized by this time around. Raped by your uncle at age 8. And then trying to escape and trying to cope, finding solace within the church. Finding out that even within the church there are demons, only to have to relive this horror again 5 years later by none other than your first cousin, your first rapist's son. Makes you wonder whether Clarence Jr. was also raped by his father, and whether that was a vicious cycle going around. Now, we all know the person that I'm talking about. He has sung a number of songs that we know and love. Gospel music, you know, St. Lucia, we're very spiritual. And the number of songs that he sang that we love, such as Stand, Speak to My Heart, Love Will Never Be, We Fall Down, Love Melodies, We Love You Lord, Ooh Child, The Prayer, I Call You Faithful, That Great Day, Wait on the Lord, and so on and so forth. The person described just now is none other than Pastor Donnie McClurkin. We all know his music. He's touched thousands of lives over the years through his music, his ministry, his pastoring, his mentoring. And that, St. Lucia, is the face of male rape. But he's not the only one. The list goes on, and these people exist, they live at various strata of society. Some of them are doctors, some of them are lawyers, some of them are news anchor persons, some of them are teachers, nurses. They exist in every strata. And so no, the face of rape is not this high school dropout or this young man who is addicted to chemicals or illegal drugs, or this middle-aged man who seemingly has not accomplished anything in his life. And no, the gender of rape is not feminine. It very much is a situation that is gender neutral. However, because we live in a very macho world, a world where men do not ever want to admit to being anything but strong. Where men do not ever want to admit that someone had control over them, whether it be a man or a woman. And yes, St. Lucia, women have been known to rape guys as well. Let us hear from another person. And mind you, all of those examples they're going to be foreign, they're not going to be localized, because we can't seem to get anybody to speak out about their experience about being raped, men that is. But we know it exists. Some of it has been recorded, but how many have been detected? I mean, once you have reported it and then investigated and then taken the 9 yards and gone to court and all of that. This is the silent killer. And sometimes we wonder why men behave the way they behave. It's because a lot of our men are broken. Now, Donnie McClurkin has attributed his homosexuality and perversion, as he terms it, to being raped. But for every Donnie McClurkin there is a Don Lemon. Raped at a tender age, maybe even half the age that Donnie was when he was first raped. Donnie was raped at 8. Don Lemon claims to have been raped around 4 years old. But he too is homosexual, but he's saying that his homosexuality has nothing to do with him being raped. Whether it is that being raped, a man being raped at a young age contributes to his homosexuality or not, one thing remains clear, is that rape is rape, no matter the gender. Now, Don Lemon is a CNN news anchor, and he says it was before the first grade. He must have been around 4 or 5 when he was first raped. His mother, being divorced, worked during the day, and his grandmother was his seater. He says she watched over his sisters and him as much as she could, but even her watchful eye wasn't enough to keep him out of the hands of his abuser. His abuser, he says, was an older teen, the son of one of his mom's friends, a neighbor, and one day he and 2 of his friends, older teen boys, and when I say all teen boys, they were almost in their 20s, preyed on him and some of the younger boys in the neighborhood. The incidents, as he referred to them in therapy years later, happened until he was 12 or 13 years old. And it was easier for him to call them incidents as opposed to what they really were, rape, because calling it molestation or rape was just too hard for him to handle, too hard for him to bear. Yet he survived. And so he says he imagines it difficult for people who haven't dealt with the abuse to confront it or face it. And they don't know what to call it, he says. So if you can't face it, then you just don't know what to call what has happened. So it's easier to refer to it as incidents, and that is how the rape culture gets perpetuated. And so he says, rather than try to define it or accept politically correct terms for it, let's just call it what it is: rape. Let's hear from Don Lemon in his own words what has happened to him. He incidentally is now a published author, and his book is called Transparent. And in this book, he talks about his ordeal as a young man. Let's hear in his own words what his ordeal was like when he was 4 or 5.
It went on from, I guess I was about 4 or 5 years old, until about 3 or 4 years before my dad died. My dad died when I was 7. And so it went on until my teens, until I started to go to junior high school or so. So it went on for a couple of years. But my mom remarried after my real dad died, and we moved out of that neighborhood, and that sort of took me out of the purview of my abuser. So it went on for quite some time.
I want you to do me a favor, because this is much better in your own words than mine. Yeah. I want you to read this excerpt from the book where you talk about that part of your life.
Okay, so you want me to do this? I wanted you to read it, but I will do it. And I have to tell you, I'm a little nervous. I've never really talked about this on national television before, so it's kind of weird to be on a show
talking about yourself,
anchor, and talking about myself. So it's a little odd here, but this is from the book.
Okay.
And it said, what had started at my grandmother's house as a rare but painful experience became a sad and frequent part of my life. I was 30 years old before I even told my mother what happened to me. The shame, the confusion, and the sense of humiliation runs that deep and becomes that twisted. Even though some experts estimate that nearly a third of all adults were molested as children, they can't be sure. Childhood sexual abuse often goes unreported and unpunished. Most children who are molested know their abusers, which was the case for me. And that was a neighbor, one of my mom's very dear friends.
This is the face of rape, St. Lucia. Notice he's well put together, he's young, he's good looking, he has everything going for him. Yet, he expected, as a news anchor and an investigator and a reporter, to have people open up to him and tell him the truth. Yet it was difficult for him to tell the truth about what happened to him. He was raped at age 4 or 5, and he was 30 before he even dared to tell his mother what had happened to him. Does that sound familiar, St. Lucia? Does that sound familiar to you men, those of you out there who know of someone who has been raped, or you who have been raped yourself? And we can all understand men have been raised differently from women across the board, especially black men. You're supposed to be tough, and you're supposed to be the providers. You're supposed to be the hunters. You're supposed to be the one doing the chasing. You're supposed to be the one hunting, not being hunted. And so it's quite difficult for those men to come out and say what has happened. We will now open the lines for your comments, but we will do so after the break. When we come back from the break, we open the lines so we can get your comments. Let's take a break.